Europe is shaking right now. Zelensky just said something so explosive, so dangerous, that EU leaders are completely speechless. He didn't just criticize, he didn't just warn, he threatened. And the name he said out loud has triggered a political earthquake that nobody, absolutely nobody, saw coming. Do not go anywhere. Something explosive just happened in the heart of European politics. A moment so tense, so raw, so deeply charged with anger and desperation that it sent shockwaves from Kyiv to Berlin to Budapest and all the way to Brussels. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the man who has stood defiant in the face of Russian missiles, who has addressed parliaments around the world, who has become the symbol of Ukrainian resistance, just launched one of the most ferocious verbal attacks we have seen from him since the war began. And this time his targets were not in Moscow. His targets were inside the European Union itself. His targets were Viktor Orban of Hungary and Friedrich Merz of Germany. And what he said, and how he said it, has left Europe absolutely stunned. To understand why this moment matters so deeply, you need to go back. Not just to last week, not just to last month, but back to a time that Zelensky himself is now invoking. The era of Viktor Yushchenko, the former president of Ukraine. Yushchenko's era was a time of hope, a time of revolution, a time when Ukraine stood at a crossroads between Russia and the West. The Orange Revolution of 2004 brought hundreds of thousands of ordinary Ukrainians into the freezing streets of Kyiv, demanding democracy, demanding dignity, demanding a future free from Russian domination. And for a brief, electric moment, it felt like the entire world was watching, and that Europe was listening. But Zelensky is now saying that what is happening today, in 2026, feels dangerously similar to that era. Not in terms of hope, but in terms of betrayal, in terms of European leaders who look away, in terms of politicians who speak the language of peace while effectively enabling war. And he is pointing his finger directly at Viktor Orban of Hungary, and, in a move that stunned many observers, at Friedrich Merz of Germany as well. Let us talk about Orban first, because the story between Zelensky and Hungary has been building for weeks, and it has now exploded into something that cannot be contained. The dispute began, at least on the surface, over oil. The Druzhba pipeline, the old Soviet-era artery that carries Russian oil through Ukraine and into Hungary and Slovakia, was damaged in a drone attack. Ukraine says it was a Russian attack. But Orban says something very different. He says Kyiv deliberately delayed the repairs. He says Ukraine is using the pipeline as a political weapon, cutting off energy to Hungary right before a national election on April 12th. He is furious, and he has made no secret of it. But the pipeline is just the visible part of the iceberg. Underneath the surface, the tension between Budapest and Kyiv runs much deeper. Orban has repeatedly refused to send weapons to Ukraine. He has repeatedly refused to allow weapons to transit through Hungarian territory. He has maintained his friendly relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, even as the rest of Europe has turned its back on Moscow. He has blocked and delayed EU aid packages to Ukraine. And he has done all of this while remaining inside the European Union, while collecting billions of euros in EU funds, while positioning himself as a victim of a Brussels elite that does not respect national sovereignty. And now he has done something else. He has gone after the EU loan. There is a 90 billion euro loan package currently being discussed for Ukraine, a loan that could be transformative, that could keep Ukraine's economy alive, that could help fund reconstruction, that could be a lifeline for a country that has been at war for 4 years. And Orban, according to Zelensky, is blocking it, or threatening to block it, or making it so politically complicated that it might not happen in time to make a difference. And that is when Zelensky said something that nobody expected. He said, and these were his actual words, that he hoped one person in the European Union would not block that loan. And then he added something that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles across the continent. He said that if that one person did block it, he would give that person's address to the Ukrainian armed forces, to the soldiers on the front line, and let them call him and talk to him in their own language. Now, stop for a moment and let that land. The president of Ukraine just suggested, even in veiled indirect language, that a European Union leader who blocks aid to Ukraine might need to be contacted by frontline Ukrainian soldiers. Budapest exploded. Hungary's government spokesperson called it an open threat, called it blackmail. said it had gone far beyond every acceptable limit in international discourse. And even Péter Magyar, Orbán's biggest political opponent inside Hungary, the man leading the Tisza party and challenging Orbán in the April elections, even he stood up and condemned Zelensky's words. That tells you everything. When your enemy's biggest rival defends him against you, you have made a serious miscalculation. Or you are so desperate that you simply do not care anymore. Orbán's response came fast and hard. He declared that Hungary would send, and he was very specific about this, no money, no weapons, and no soldiers to Ukraine. Not now, not ever, as far as he is concerned. He accused Kiev of blackmail. He accused Zelensky of threatening the freedom of the Hungarian people. He invoked national sovereignty. He invoked neutrality. And he framed himself as a peacemaker in a continent that has lost its mind and gone to war. Now enter Viktor Yushchenko, the former Ukrainian president who led Ukraine during the Orange Revolution, who survived a poisoning attempt widely attributed to Russian operatives, who spent years trying to build bridges between Ukraine and the West. He wrote an open letter to Orbán, a deeply personal letter. He attached an old photograph of himself and Orbán from 1999, when both men were serving as prime ministers of their countries, standing together, smiling, full of the optimism of a new post-Cold War Europe. And in the letter, Yushchenko wrote words that cut right to the bone. He recalled a time when the future of their region seemed shared and bright. He remembered Orbán as a man who once understood the value of dignity. And he said, "Stop. Stop and remember who you once were." This is what Zelensky is now referencing when he talks about the Yushchenko era. He is not just talking about the Orange Revolution. He is talking about a time when Hungary's leader was on the right side of history, a time when Orbán was a young, pro-Western, anti-communist reformer who believed in European values and democratic freedom. And now Zelensky is holding up that image, that 1999 photograph, and asking Europe to compare it to what Orbán has become in 2026. The contrast is devastating, and it is clearly intentional. But Orbán's response to Yushchenko's letter was cold and dismissive. He essentially told the former Ukrainian president to pass his message on to Zelensky, and told him to warn the current Ukrainian leader to keep his hands off the freedom of the Hungarian people. It was not the response of a man who was moved by nostalgia or moral appeals. It was the response of a man who has calculated where his interests lie and is not changing course. And now we come to Friedrich Merz. This is where the story gets even more complicated and, honestly, more alarming. Merz is the new Chancellor of Germany. He is a conservative. He has presented himself as a strong supporter of Ukraine. He co-signed a joint agreement with Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris just a few months ago about the potential deployment of European troops in Ukraine following any ceasefire. He has said that Russia has shown no willingness to negotiate peace and that easing sanctions would be wrong. On paper, Merz looks like an ally, but Zelensky is apparently not satisfied. And this is where sources diverge and where the situation becomes genuinely murky. What exactly did Zelensky say about Merz? What is the specific complaint? Based on what is emerging, it appears Zelensky's frustration with Merz is tied to the broader question of how European leaders are framing the role of Russian soldiers, specifically in the context of any future ceasefire or peace deal. The concern from Kyiv is that some European leaders, including potentially Merz, are leaving a door open to arrangements that would effectively legitimize Russian military presence on Ukrainian territory, even in some kind of frozen conflict scenario. And for Zelensky, for Ukraine, that is not peace. That is surrender with a diplomatic label. The Yushchenko comparison is particularly pointed here, because what happened in the years after the Orange Revolution, what happened under Yushchenko's presidency, was ultimately a story of hope deferred. Russia never really accepted a Western-leaning Ukraine. The promised EU and NATO membership never materialized. The goodwill from Europe faded. The window of opportunity closed. And then came Yanukovych, and then came the Maidan Revolution, and then came the annexation of Crimea, and then came Donbass, and then came the full-scale invasion of 2022. Zelensky is saying, loudly, furiously, publicly, that he sees the same pattern repeating. He sees European leaders making nice-sounding statements while leaving Ukraine exposed. He sees the same fatal hesitation that allowed Russia to regroup and strike again and again over the course of 20 years. And he is terrified, not for himself, This is a man who stayed in Kyiv when Russia sent assassination teams to kill him in the first days of the full-scale invasion. He is not afraid for himself. He is terrified for his country. He is terrified that Ukraine will once again be offered promises that turn to dust, while Russian soldiers remain on Ukrainian soil, while Russian missiles remain ready to fly, while the clock ticks and the West grows tired and moves on to the next crisis. The reaction across Europe to all of this has been intense. In Brussels, EU officials are quietly furious, not just at Orban, which is nothing new, but at the spectacle of a war ally publicly threatening a member state. Diplomats are speaking in hushed tones about the damage this kind of language does to Ukraine's political standing in Europe, even among countries that are deeply sympathetic to Kyiv's cause. In Berlin, there is discomfort with being lumped together with Budapest. Germany sees itself as fundamentally different from Hungary on the Ukraine question, and in many ways it is. But Zelensky is sending a message that being insufficiently forceful is itself a form of betrayal. In Hungary, the political timing could not be more explosive. With the April 12th election just weeks away, this confrontation between Zelensky and Orban is playing out in real time during a campaign season. Orban is using the conflict to reinforce his narrative that he is the only leader standing between Hungary and being dragged into a catastrophic European war. His supporters are rallying. And the pipeline dispute, the tangible, visible, cold and dark homes kind of issue, is giving him concrete material to work with. And yet underneath all the noise, underneath all the theater of diplomatic insults and open letters and election campaign positioning, there is a real and devastating human story. Ukrainian soldiers are dying every single day. Russian forces are still occupying Ukrainian territory. The war that was supposed to be over in days, according to Putin's original plan, is now in its fourth year. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been displaced. Cities have been reduced to rubble. And the question of whether Europe will stay united, whether the money will keep flowing, whether the weapons will keep arriving, whether the political will is still there, that question has enormous life and death consequences for real people. Zelensky knows this better than anyone. He lives it every day. And perhaps that is why his language has become so raw, so undiplomatic, so willing to cross lines that a more conventional politician would never cross. He is not playing the long game of career diplomacy. He is playing the survival game of a nation fighting for its existence. And in that context, threatening to give Orban's address to Ukrainian soldiers does not look like a diplomatic blunder. It looks like the scream of a man who feels like he is running out of time, and running out of allies, and running out of patience with leaders who treat his country's survival as a bargaining chip. This is the story of 2026 in Europe. It is not the clean, clear story of democracy versus autocracy that the early months of the war seemed to offer. It is messier than that. It is a story of exhaustion and election cycles and energy prices and old photographs of men who used to be friends. It is a story of a continent trying to hold itself together while a war rages on its eastern edge, and while the political center in country after country faces pressure from nationalist movements that promise peace through appeasement. What happens next? Nobody knows for certain. The EU lone vote will come. Orban will either back down under pressure or he will block it and face consequences. Potentially the triggering of Article 7. Potentially the suspension of Hungary's voting rights in the EU. The April 12th Hungarian election will either return Orban to power or, for the first time in 15 years, bring a new government to Budapest. Merz will either step up Germany's support for Ukraine in a way that satisfies Kiev, or the rift between Berlin and Kiev will quietly deepen. And Zelensky will keep fighting, diplomatically, politically, and militarily, because for him, there is no other option. The Yushchenko era ended in disappointment, in broken promises, in a democratic revolution that eventually got swallowed by the gravity of Russian power and European hesitation. Zelensky is determined not to let that happen again. He is determined that this time, Ukraine will not be abandoned on the altar of European comfort and convenience. Whether he succeeds, whether Europe finds the courage and the unity to see this through, that is the question that will define this decade. And that is exactly why you need to stay informed. That is exactly why channels like Nova Euro News exist, to cut through the noise, to follow the story where it leads, to give you the full picture. If you found this video valuable, please share it with someone who needs to understand what is really happening in Europe right now. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story this important. This is Nova Euro News. We will see you in the next one.